Well, good afternoon, friends. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our third annual Celebrate the Fellows event. Before I say a few words about the event, a word about masking. All year long in this building, we have strongly encouraged the use of masks. On today's occasion, the ultimate purpose of which is to celebrate the fellows. We happen to have several fellows who have health conditions that would benefit from masks. So if you don't have one and you want to wear one, there are masks out in the lobby, but we strongly urge people to wear them while in the building, as we've done all year long. Celebrate the fellows. The first event in this, the first iteration of this celebration took place in May of 2019. Seems like a long time ago. And we canceled it in 2020 for obvious reasons. And last year, we gathered it entirely online. So here in 2022, even masked, it feels like a gift, almost an indulgence, to be able to welcome you all back in person to the center. Now that embrace gathers up not only the people here in person in Leventhal Hall, of course, but it extends to our remote audience, maybe especially our remote audience. Institutions can make plans, but individuals get to make choices, whether they're ready to return to in-person events or not. Happily, whatever comes in the future, you will always be able to attend our events in our new hybrid format, both in person and online. That will be the new normal for everything we do. Today's celebration is an event that we refused to either cancel or postpone or put entirely online, because we wanted to send the signal that no matter what happens, we're always here, either hybrid or entirely online. And whoever you may be, both those of you in person, but also especially those of you watching us remotely, past or current fellow, member of the Stanford community, alumnus, supporter, you should feel warmly included at not only this celebration, but our many lectures and other public events. So today we celebrate the fellows who've been in residence with us all year. They represent all stages of the intellectual life, prominent senior figures in their fields, postdoctoral scholars at the beginnings of their careers, PhD students completing dissertations, and undergraduates writing their own projects. They come from all over the US and the world. For the in-person audience, we have prepared a print program with thumbnail posters for each fellow, but these images are designed to be seen online. Please go to the page for this event. It's called Celebrate the Fellows on the SHC website for the link that will permit you to read about these fellows in the proper format. The remote audience will also have an online program. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that to our remote audience that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen, where you see CC to start or stop the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, or adjust captions as needed. Our format today includes 3 brief talks by current Humanities Center fellows. They will share the research they've been pursuing this year, and we will then, after the presentations, we'll proceed with a panel discussion for about 30 minutes to explore more deeply the question of how the research done at the center makes a difference in the world. And then for the last segment, they'll look forward to taking your questions. And of course, for those of you in person, we have a nice reception waiting outside. For our virtual attendees, please enter your questions as they arise into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And I'd also like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And now to briefly introduce our 3 presenters. Speaking first is Eli Cook, Associate Professor of History at the University of Haifa. Following Eli will be Lucía Martínez Valdivia, Associate Professor of English Literature and Humanities at Reed College. And finally, Traci Parker, Associate Professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Eli, thanks for starting us off.
Thank you, Roland. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's a real honor to be one of the fellows presenting today. So I'm an historian of American capitalism, and one of the central notions or themes that goes throughout the history of American capitalism is the idea of choice, of course. And in 2008, a book came out that you probably might have heard of. It was a pretty big bestseller. It was called Nudge. It was written by two behavioral economists, actually one behavioral economist, Richard Thaler, and Cass Sunstein. And Thaler later won the Nobel Prize in Economics, in part because of this book. And in that book, they introduced the idea of a choice architect, the people who are the menu makers, the curators of our choices. Basically, the people who kind of decide what are going to be the choices that are made available to us. Now, anyone who's read Nudge knows that it's pretty upbeat. It's kind of like a very self-helpy like book. Sold a lot of copies, maybe in part because of that. And it basically kind of presents choice architects as mostly kind of nudging people, and I think that word is important, nudge, so there's no real kind of power forces involved, just a nudge. People are still free, you know, kind of to do what they really want. And most of the examples given in the book, including the opening example, is kind of nudging people to better decisions, better health decisions. For instance, the classic example, which the book starts with, is this woman who reorganizes the school cafeterias in her area so that kids will eat healthier food. Now, I think the idea of choice architecture is a brilliant one. And the fact that the term didn't even exist really speaks a lot to how we've often ignored that side of choices. Whether it's economists or psychologists or other disciplines, usually when people just study decision-making or choices or how we make choices, they usually focus from the point of view of the chooser, kind of the person who is making these decisions. They have kind of all the agency, and that is kind of the epitome of freedom in many ways in a capitalist society, the right to choose, or the freedom to choose, as Milton Friedman, of course, put it in his groundbreaking 1980 book and PBS documentary, that in many ways kind of today is seen as kind of like one of the first works of what some people would call the neoliberal era. The idea of this project is to kind of flip things, to kind of show us choice from the point of view of the people who build the choices, the choice architects. And so in that sense, it's like Nudge. The reason it's not so much like Nudge is I'm interested more in kind of, first of all, broadly kind of exploring all the different choice architects that have existed in American history, mostly in the 20th century, because as I argue in my book, choice architecture or structured choice is really in many ways a 20th century invention. Okay, there were very few instances, even ballots, and someone can ask me in the Q&A if they want, didn't work in the way they do now through most of 19th century politics. It's very rare, incredibly rare, that someone would ever be kind of introduced to like 4 choices and he would have to pick one in the 19th century. Even if he walked into a store and wanted things to buy, usually all the goods were behind the counter and he just told them that he wanted, 6 pounds of potatoes. So the pictures that I put here in my one slide kind of give you a general idea of the different choice architects and choice architectures that I look at in the book. So the first chapter talks about the invention of multiple choice testing. Now, a lot has been written on standardized testing, on the very problematic origins of standardized testing, to be frank, the racist and the eugenic origins of standardized testing. But what struck me is that very few of these studies actually look at the multiple choice format. And what I did is kind of dug down into that actual format and discovered that the person who invented it, Robert Yerkes, he was a psychobiologist at Harvard, had first invented a machine that was designed for both people and animals. And they were kind of given a wooden box with keys, and they were supposed to choose the key according to some kind of riddle or problem that they got that was going to discover or reveal their innate genetic intelligence. Now, it's not a coincidence that Robert Yerkes is the one who invented multiple choice or this idea. Before that, he had become one of the leading scholars of putting rats in mazes. Now, what is a maze? In many ways, maze is a choice architecture. It's the idea that we're going to build a very structured kind of box, and we're going to give people choices, or in this case, rats, although I'm guessing you can see where the metaphor is going. And through the choices that they make in this maze, we're going to study their behavior, we're going to unlock their preferences, we're going to see what they do and what they don't do, what they like and what they dislike. But all the time, we are in some ways in control, despite the fact that they're really making actual choices. At the end of the day, we're funneling them, that's one of the key ideas in my book, towards certain outcomes. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is on something that's also ubiquitous. And as you can see throughout all these chapters, I am really in some ways trying to look at also the analog origins of digital capitalism. And in this way, trying to show that a lot of the things that we think are new and in some ways problematic about the tech world actually are not new. One other example that I write about in the second chapter of my book is the industrial psychologists in the 1920s who invented the 5-point employee rating system. You know, something that's so ubiquitous to us today. You know, you leave the bathroom, they're asking you for the smiley face, or you get off a call center, they want to know you have a survey, or of course the Uber app, where if some of you don't know, if you kind of if someone is rated below like a 4.4, they get knocked off the website and probably can in many ways lose their livelihood. So I studied the industrial psychologists who first invented that choice box, you know, that idea that we're going to rate and rank people 1 through 5, and in that way kind of, you know, both discipline them, but also change the way people think about themselves. What's interesting about that is that the people who invented that were really looking for a way to kind of monitor white-collar workers. In Taylorism and in other forms of industrialization, it was easy to kind of track the working class. You know, you just kind of count the widgets that they made. But how do you rate the manager? How do you rate the salesman? How do you rate kind of like the white-collar? A lot of times they would do it through these ratings. And I don't have a page for you today, but the ratings themselves, of course, what you're being rated on kind of really shows you what are the kind of, how are you being pushed into certain directions, whether it's your energy or your loyalty to the company or your physique or your manner or things like that. The third chapter is on the invention of the like button, which was not invented by Mark Zuckerberg. It was invented by who would go on to become the president of CBS Radio in the 1930s, Frank Stanton. And much like the internet, he realized that in radio, the listeners are not the consumers, they're in many ways the product, and therefore he really wanted to know what parts of the radio did they like and did they not like. So he put them into a room, and music was piped in, and they were given 2 choices. Press a red button if they don't like what they hear, press a green button if they do. And I traced kind of the rise of these like buttons all the way towards what we now know are the recommendation algorithms that in many ways curate and kind of design the menus that we are presented to in almost any walks of life, whether it's shopping on Amazon or on Netflix, or really in almost any other platform that we have on the digital world. The later chapters, though, also try to get at the cultural aspects of this story. One of the chapters discusses why the Pepsi Challenge. For those of you who don't know, the Pepsi Challenge in the late 1970s was a blind taste test where, for whatever reason, and no one knows quite why, Pepsi was very good at winning. People seem to prefer Pepsi towards Coke. And while this might seem like kind of like a very silly kind of marketing story, I argue it has a very kind of deep, actually, economic shift in that until the Pepsi Challenge, economists believed in something called revealed preference, which meant, you know, markets are going to let us see what people like. We just have to follow the market data. But what Pepsi Challenge argued is that no, sometimes the market doesn't get at our preferences, and therefore we need to put people into little experiments. We need to put them into little labs. We need to constantly be running experiments on them to see what they like and what they don't like. We can't trust just the market data. And that's essentially what the Pepsi Challenge did, but that's also essentially what we begin to see in almost every walk of life, these kind of rise of the choice experiments. Here at Stanford, it's the Marshmallow Test, where it was argued that children who could delay their gratification would succeed in life. Later, it turned out that it was mostly a way to predict if someone was working class or not. Another option, another example of this is even the choice experiments, something called Conjoint Analysis. If there are any marketers in the room, when new products go to sale, almost any new product, they don't really do focus groups that much anymore. What they do is these things where they just flash choices to people and they're asked to choose each time this and this and this, and the kind of algorithm builds a lot like a recommendation engine. What are their preferences and what are they not? So those are a few examples of the kind of choice architectures that I go through in the book. There are other ones like the Choose Your Own Adventure book, which I'd love to talk about in the Q&A if you're interested, a big hit in the 1980s. And I try to show through them the cultural shifts that are occurring in the United States as more and more people kind of on one hand become, believe in this notion of freedom and choice, but actually their choices are becoming more and more structured. And now we even have books that kind of lay out these mazes for them in textual form. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure we'll get to more in the QA. And thank you all for listening. And it was my pleasure to bring invite our next speaker, Lucía, to give her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And thank you to Roland and the Center for hosting us. That's my face. And so I'll try to keep my remarks brief. I'm much less exciting a speaker than Eli, for which I apologize. So I work on the origins and development of English poetic forms. And I focus especially on 16th and 17th century lyric verse. My approach to the study of poetry, and this is going to inform the actual topic, so I just want to lay this out. My approach to the study of poetry is shaped primarily by three methodologies, which are formalism, lyric theory, and material text studies. Formalism, for those of you who don't know, pays close attention to the structure of language as expressed by, for example, its rhythm, its meter, its stanzaic structure. Lyric theory tends to focus on the relationship between the reader of a poem and the sound of a poem, in particular, what we might think of as its voice, right? The voice held by a poem or the voice of a reader reading a poem. And material text studies is the field that used to be known in a smaller, more limited form as book history, and that is now expanded to think about how the material forms texts take can shape a reader's experience of that text, right? For example. And I guess the unifying thread in my scholarship has been an interest in meter and the sound of poetry, whether it's read silently or read aloud, whether it's individually read or communally read. It's also been an interest in the phenomenology of reading lyric poetry, right? How does it feel in your mind? What happens in your mind when you read a poem? And an interest in how readers, both in the past and now in the present, have encountered the sounds of written poetry. And so the question I've been working on this year, or trying to work on this year, is when we read, what do we hear? And this is the difficult part, why? Right? If you happen to hear something in your head, what is it? And how does that happen? Recently in literary studies and in sound studies, which are two fields that have kind of been far apart, there's been a lot of interest in the topic of the mind's ear. And this scholarship has frequently been frustrated by a lack of sufficiently accurate terminology. And instead they make do with terms like inner speech, inner voice, ear voice, perceptual mimesis, imagination, sound image, auditory image. I don't know what an auditory image is. I really struggle with that, right? And these terms capture different aspects of the experience of sound in the mind, right? They all sort of focus on different areas, and they also have different limits. Focusing exclusively on voice, for example, or suggesting a very particular relationship between the body and the mind, in which the mind is potentially sort of tethered and limited to real world experiences. And this range of terminology has also posed a challenge to our ability to make connections between fields, across fields, to locate the work of fellow scholars in different disciplines thinking productively about closely related ideas. So I am using the term audiation to think about text and to think about sound. This is not a word that I have invented at all, but one that I've imported into literary studies and sound studies from the world of music education. In that discipline, in music ed, it's used to refer to the mental faculty that produces an experience of inward hearing separate from physically perceived sound, right? So there's the sound that you actually hear with your ears, and then there is the sound that happens in your mind. It can happen, this inward experience can happen when you remember something, such as if you've ever had a song stuck in your head, right? Willingly, unwillingly, however, that's an example of musical audiation. Or it can happen through invention, right? Which is what a composer might do as they are creating something new in their minds. Audiation can be prompted by reading notated music, if you happen to be able to read music, or it can happen prior to that too, in that sort of purely mental space. We can also, and this is where I'm headed this year, we can also audiate things that are prompted by reading alphabetic notation rather than musical notation, as with the voice or voices that might resonate in your head when you read a novel or a poem or an article or a tweet, right? And this is the angle that got me interested in the topic. Traditionally, we talk about voice a lot in the study of lyric poetry, both in research and in introducing students to the concept of lyric. That's kind of the gateway to thinking about lyric, as we tell them, what is this voice in this poem? With audiation, what I'm doing is, I hope I'm doing, is offering up a keyword that can contain voice and also make room for other kinds of acoustic experiences that are prompted by reading. And this lets us think about how we hear texts rather than how we speak them. It gets at the range of aspects of the mind's ear currently cropping up in sound studies and literary studies, and I think it opens up new possibilities that traditional terminology has sort of cut off or foreclosed. So this is kind of a schema, I guess, of the possibilities of audiation, or some of the possibilities of audiation. Up at the top is voice, and within that, vocalization and subvocalization. And these are the traditional ways that we think about sound in relationship to written texts. Vocalization is what I'm doing now. It also might be the voice that you sort of feel in your head when you read, if you happen to have an experience like that. Subvocalization, that's what happens if, I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but you're reading a sentence and you stumble across a new word and you can't figure out where the stress is. And so maybe you mouth it silently to yourself, or you even sort of feel yourself going through the motions inside your body, but you don't produce a sound. So as long as the sort of processes of producing speech are recruited by the mind, you're subvocalizing, whether or not sound is produced. That's the traditional sort of sound and text world. What I'm trying to open up are sort of spaces beyond that. So non-vocal word sounds, some readers hear words in their minds, they audiate words as sound, but they don't have a voice in their head when they do that. And that's something, I think, a phenomenon that hasn't really been tracked and that I'm trying to open up. Onomatopoeia, you might remember that from like an intro lit class, right? The pig oinks, the train screeches, right? The sound of the word imitates the sound that it's marking. But you can also have sound description, right? I can write out a description of a musical event. I can say, oh, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was played by the New York Philharmonic, and somebody might call up a recording in their mind. Or I might say, oh, Stairway to Heaven was on the radio last night, and then I'm really sorry, that might be stuck in your head now, right? So that's like, you can have different kinds of sound description that aren't necessarily onomatopoetic, that can trigger the audiation in different ways. And then also at a sort of, this is where my poetry background comes in, you can also think about the rhythm or the meter of a text, sort of creating an experience of sound that doesn't necessarily have to do with voice or with the sound of a word, that you can feel the pulse or audiate the pulse of, say, an iambic pentameter line separate from the words. And so that's another thing that I've been trying to think about here. So as a critical term, audiation, I think, helps isolate the auditory from the visual and the auditory from the vocal. Not because I think that these things need to live apart, but as we sort of can isolate and identify them and understand each mechanism better, I think we can figure out how they play together more clearly. And that's really been a struggle for people in sound studies interested in this topic. And it, I think, also helps acknowledge that there is a world of sound available to the mind that might not be tethered to our physical hearing experience, right? And you see this in historical terms in the period I work in representations of the music of the heavens or the music of the spheres, right? Those were sounds that were theorized as not being, like, humans cannot hear that. And yet here they are writing poetic descriptions of it meant for readers. So how do we then call up that sound in our minds, right? So to explore this topic, I'm bringing sort of very standard literary critical approaches like formalism, histories of reading, histories of the book, critical theory, some aspects of phenomenology. I'm bringing those into contact with other disciplines like cognitive psychology and linguistics and sound studies. Connections have occurred between these fields in a scattered sort of way, and I'm trying to really get everything into the same book. Not to be comprehensive about that, but to show that those connections are there and to try to start bringing people together into the same conversation, which I hope will be really productive. Audiation, as sort of modeled by the discipline I just described, right? Audiation can be shaped by factors like the methods used to teach children to read, by personal inclination to or away from sound, by cultural norms around the relationships between text and sound, or by other factors that we haven't really identified yet. And what all that means, put very simply, is that different readers audiate differently, both from one another and from moment to moment, whether passively or actively. And ultimately, that's what's the most important to me in this project, that this concept of audiation will help broaden our awareness of that range of readerly experience and help readers develop them further, both at those sort of very beginning levels and then also sort of throughout their lives and educations. So that's my little piece, and I'm happy to talk more about the chapters or the details in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Traci.
Good afternoon. I want to echo my colleagues' pleasure and honor about being a fellow here this year. I want to do something a little different. I actually want to begin by telling you a short civil rights love story. And it's the one captured here, which would be your upper left-hand corner, the black and white image of this young couple. The 15th of March, 1960 was a life-changing day for 19-year-old James Clybourne and 21-year-old Emily England. The future South Carolina Congressman Clybourne and more than 1,000 students began that cold, wet, and dreary day, marching peacefully from South Carolina State College and Clafton University towards downtown Orangeburg to protest Jim Crow. He and 388 others, however, never made it to their intended destination. En route, protesters were arrested and incarcerated in the overcrowded Orangeburg County Jail. After hours of discomfort and distress, a tired and famished Clybourne was brought into the main courtroom of the county jail to be released on bond. As he waited, he mingled with fellow protesters, students who had also been detained, but also students who had come to show their support. And he then spoke very loudly of his hunger. His words, Clybourne writes in his autobiography, quote, found their way in the direction of a cute 99-pound co-ed named Emily England. She then responded by thrusting toward him a sandwich she and some other students had brought to the courthouse for those who had been incarcerated. He reached for it, and with an impish grin, she drew it away, broke it in half, and they shared a hamburger. 15 months later, on June 24th, 1961, the two married and would remain so for the next 58 years. Their marriage, much like others that were established during the mid-20th century civil rights movement, was one whereby James and Emily were not only devoted to each other, but also the Black freedom movement. My project focuses on all of these individuals who are here screened on camera. The one next to James Clybourne and Emily England are actually a couple who were married by Martin Luther King, a very young couple who are still married today. You've got Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott on the far end. And then you have SNCC and two Black Panther Party members, the far end being Eldridge Cleaver and Kathleen Cleaver, who were married in what they called revolutionary weddings in the Black Panther Party. During my tenure here as a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center, I've been working on my new book project called Beyond Loving: Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement, which tells these and other stories. Beyond Loving examines African-American romantic relationships in the civil rights and Black power movements. Historians concerned with mid-20th century intimacies have overwhelmingly focused on the Supreme Court decision outlawing anti-miscegenation laws in Loving v. Virginia and the decline of Black marriages. And so as a result, what my people, or I guess historians, have done is that we failed to fully appreciate Black couples who often far outnumbered interracial ones on the battlegrounds of the civil rights movement. Using archival records, including those housed here in special collections, particularly the Huey P. Newton records, have been essential to my work on the Black Panther Party, but also memoirs and oral history interviews. Beyond Loving argues that the civil rights and Black power movements not only generated important and lasting shifts between Blacks and whites, but also among Black men and women. Black activists explored unconventional ideas related to the structure of their romantic relationships, with the goal of realizing Black liberation. Black relationships, casual and committed, as well as heterosexual and homosexual, thus became sites for confronting racism and gender and sexual inequalities. Beyond Loving concludes that Black couples were transforming in diverse and inclusive ways that built on Black traditions and advanced new conceptualizations of partnership and marriage, family, and community during and after the civil rights movement. So my hope is that in doing this work, which is certainly a work in progress, that I will expose the importance of Black romantic relationships in the Black freedom movement. And I'm hoping that this enriches our understanding of love, family, and revolution, not only in the 20th century, but in the 21st century. And I'm hoping to do so in three major ways. First, it connects love and activism, right? It illustrates that there's a collision of revolutions going on in the mid-century. So it's not just the civil rights movement hanging over by itself or the Black power movement. It's this collision that activists are feeling between civil rights, Black power, sex, gay, women's liberation. And that all of this is shaping how they're understanding Black gender, Black family, and Black community. Second, this book is navigating silences in the historical record to provide new insights into the lives and experiences of Black activists. And in doing so, what I hope I'm doing is actually humanizing activists who so often are just known for the end result or the dangers that they were dealing with. In doing so, really, a lot of the work that I've been able to uncover are issues around sex and sexuality in the African-American community. And these are topics that historical actors have often concealed because of a culture of dissemblance. This is a term that was coined by the historian Darlene Clark Hine to refer to Black women's historic practice of concealing their private lives to protect themselves from their oppressors. And finally, the book, I hope, will join a growing body of literature that dispels the fallacy that Black partnerships, marriages, and families have been historically dysfunctional and pathological. And thereby, I'm humanizing Black activists by truly considering their efforts to reformulate love, commitment, and marriage. Thank you.
So you've heard for 5 minutes each about 3 projects. We have 33 other projects that we could have talked about here. I hope, for those of you who are our visitors, I hope it gives you a sense of the intellectual richness that's being developed under our roof all year long. We're very lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have all of you here. And what I'd like to do is just start by asking a couple of questions of the three, and then maybe a few individual questions, and then turn it over to the audience for your questions. Let me start by, since our rubric for today is what difference does it make? Meaning, ultimately, what is the significance of everything that we do here? Why does it matter? What difference does it make? I'm going to start with a really general question for the three presenters. It seems to me, listening to you, and of course I've heard each of you speak about your projects at greater length before, that all three of you are, in a sense, changing a familiar story. Just to go in reverse order, Traci's case is, it's clear you're taking a story that is part of an essential episode in 20th century American history, the story of the civil rights era and the Black Power movement. And you are reminding us that love, sexuality, marriage were always part of that story, but that the story comes out differently when we pay attention to those factors. Lucía's intervening in a different kind of story. It's something very personal. It's the story we tell ourselves about why the world sounds the way it does and what the factors are in hearing things. And you're reminding us that hearing, just in the shift from the everyday word hearing and the everyday word voice to the technical term audiation, and then back again, you're reminding us that this is a very complex process, and perhaps the way we do it in poetry, in reading we have this in common because we're both poetry scholars, that the way we do this in reading poetry, that we need to think about it in a more complicated way than we have so far, and perhaps learn something from music theory and musical practice. And then, Eli is somewhere in between. It's not so personal. It's not at the level of the broad panorama of American history in the 20th century. It's more like every time we encounter a structured choice out in the world, which we probably do every single day, probably several times a day, we might, if we're not thinking about it too much, I often am not, we might delude ourselves into thinking that this is a phenomenon that doesn't have a history, or that it's always been that way, and that it just exists, and you're giving it a history again. You're reminding us that it is there are alternatives to this. It was not always this way. There were individuals with specific motives behind this, and so on. So my question for all three of you is, it is the what difference does it make question. It's when we tell the story differently based on the kind of research you're doing and the kind of insights you give us, what difference will that make? Traci touched on this in her thing. You gave us sort of several reasons why it makes a big difference, but I'm going to give you another pass at it. But for all three, why, what difference does it make to tell the story you're concerned with in this different way? Who wants to go first?
I will
go for it. Yeah.
I think for oftentimes, and maybe I'll just make this a little more personal, I teach the history of the civil rights movement to 180 students every fall at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And for them, it seems so distant. And these individuals seem like superheroes in a way, right? Martin Luther King doesn't feel like, I have to remind him, he's in his 20s. He seems like a huge dude. He's a short man. Not to talk badly about Martin Luther King. I don't come from a tall family, so that's fine. But there's a piece of it where it feels as though they're just not human. right? And I have them read many things. You know, you read a lot of primary sources as historians, one of which is Anne Moody's autobiography, and it feels a bit depressing at times, right? There's some trauma that's going on with these individuals who are trying to fight for their lives and fight for the lives of those who follow them. But there's a way that people are coping, right? There's things about these individuals that I think my students can relate to. And that's being in love and trying to figure out what your sexuality is and what it means to be in your 20s and all of these things that you are grappling with as you're growing up. These individuals are doing so on the battlegrounds of on something that's very major, right? And has certainly changed race relations in this country. And so I think that's for me, I think that's a lot of the reason why I came to this work.
Thank you.
I'll take a slightly different run at it. So for me, I think one of the things you said, Roland, I found especially sort of resonant, pun intended, is that in that history, I think, and I'm thinking here again about the classroom, helps us model alternatives to what students perceive as truths in the world. And for something like Audiation, it can even, I think, help challenge universalizing assumptions they make about things as intimate as their own bodies and their own minds, and sort of what is true and what is natural, right? Versus, and it can help them think about what is constructed and the ways in which processes that they take for granted, like reading and what happens in their mind and their experience to sound, how those processes are in fact constructed and influenced in different ways, and that we also have the agency to shape them and to influence them. The Audiation is something that you can work on developing, you can exercise it, you can stretch it, you can really push it. And I think for the historical factor for me, I mean, so when in my classrooms, I ask my poetry students, so what do you hear in your head when you read this? Everybody has a different answer. Everybody also assumes that everybody else was hearing the same thing, right? And so that moment is a kind of mind-blowing one for them, in which they realize the degree to which they are assuming things that they maybe shouldn't be assuming. And in taking the historical perspective too, I think that helps them further understand the degree to which our own experiences of our bodies are culturally contingent and historically contingent and politically contingent, that the ways we process sounds, whether with our ears or with our minds, those change across time. A person in the Middle Ages is not going to be attuned to sound in the same way that we are, whether through their physical ears or in the mind. And so that's one way, like that's one way into which sort of we can start having these discussions. That's, I don't know, as somebody who tends to study 16th century Reformation poetry, it's kind of the so what can be really challenging. And that's one way in which I can start to get them thinking about that.
And what is wrong with 16th century poetry? I'd like to know.
I think it's wildly entertaining, and I like the humanities as things that are not me, but other people want to see themselves. So.
Right. Thank you, Eli.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
No,
I don't know if I hate it. So first of all, actually, after writing a book about 19th century economic statistics, this book actually in many ways is much more personal to me as a child of the 1980s who loved choosing your own adventure books. I have a part in the book about the stock market game. I don't know how many kids here played that, but in 5th grade, we all became little day traders. And if you want to understand how many of the younger generations today understand things like Peter Pan apps, and it helps to kind of look at these things that were happening in schools in the 1980s and 90s. But actually, I think Roland nailed it when he said that really my goal has always been as an historian is to take the things that we take it for granted, are just obvious, things that, of course, it's always been like that. And to just, the number one thing is to just show people it hasn't always been this way. And the first thing you do by telling someone it hasn't always been this way means, first of all, it doesn't need to be this way. But also, as Roland said, that there were people who created this, and then we need to know what their motivations were, why they were doing this, how they use these techniques and practices and inventions, and where all this comes from. And at the end of the day, I think I've always been driven by that kind of desire to bring out the critical sides of everything. And I think one of the most important parts of the humanities in general is kind of, teaching people to think critically about every single thing and saying, why is it like this and why is that like that and where did this come from? But then also for me, when I kind of think of like what difference does this make, it always comes back to questions of power and questions, if you focus on choice only from the point of view of the chooser, then you get narratives which I don't want to pile on to the economists here, or even sometimes, but oftentimes it become kind of hegemonic, where it's all this methodological individualism, where it's all about my preferences and my demand curves and my wants and my needs, and you never really get these questions of power, often because power is very hard to model. Luckily, I don't need to build a model or a predictive model. So I think I can kind of focus on those questions of power. And then I think in today's world, where we officially now spend more time in this than we do sleeping, then yeah, we need to start thinking all the time about the things that we take for granted when we enter into the choice box.
Let me ask a different question of each one of you based on your project, and then I'll turn it over to all of you. First, Eli, what, if you think expansively about this project and imagine that it really lands with a bang in the broader culture and gets the readership it should, what might this do to change the way we think about the notion of freedom?
Thanks. So I like to end, obviously this was a short talk, but I like to end a lot of my talks on this subject with a C. Wright Mills quote. And he says that, freedom is not just choosing from a set of alternatives, it's being part of the conversation of what those alternatives will be. So having the power and the conversation to choose at first, what even are the options going to be on the table? Because oftentimes when I discuss power, it's what isn't even on the table, who got to decide what possibilities are not even there, but also just questions of who gets to shape the menus. And so for me, questions of power, and again questions of freedom, always go back to these more kind of pushing the envelope on what democracy is, first of all. And it can't be just us going into a little choice box every 4 years and choosing from a menu of 4 options, but it needs to be a constant debate and collaboration and struggle and arguments over what are going to be even what the choices that we're going to present other people with, and what choices we should kind of even debate being given. So I would say, to me, that's always been, and here I'll just end by saying, very importantly, my book is very critical in some ways, but there are definitely also, I think, ways in which I hope some other people, maybe people even who are programmers, who are more on the tech side, can read this book and develop applications which would allow kind of maybe we could allocate resources in ways where we all get to kind of choose certain projects and argue over which projects will be then funded, and kind of bring democracy down, use these amazing technologies, these choice architectures, in a way that's much more democratic, much more collaborative, and that way kind of bring a new freedom that isn't just me scrolling and choosing from these algorithms.
Lucía, what are the implications that emerged as you've been working on this project that have surprised you the most?
So I think the thing that I found most unexpected, and the thing that I feel most challenged by, because it's not something I've worked on ever before, and I don't want to dally in it. So I'm hoping that this is a baton that somebody else can take up, but if not, I will try it, is the degree to which this project might have something to learn from and contribute to disability studies, especially people working on deafness. What happens? What is the sound experience of the mind there? Is there one at all? How could it be used? How could our own sort of heightened awareness of audiation, of the different levels of like rhythm and meter and non-vocal sounds, how can those be potentially used in the instruction of language to people who can't sort of hear in the way that others can. And so that to me, it's the kind of thing that I've been interested in when I come across disability studies talk at a conference, but I've never felt sort of, we all have the million other things that we're thinking about. And so that was one, I mean, it's kind of the opposite in some ways of what I set out to think about. I set out to think about sound, and I assumed that I would be thinking about hearing. And I have, but in a sort of, mirror image way. And so I've started to struggle with that. I don't know where that will end up. Again, I think it's really challenging to do work in that way if you don't specialize in it, if you're not learned. It can be really tempting to kind of dabble, which I don't think is right. So I'm trying to figure out how to navigate those waters, and who might be able to help, or who might be able to even do that work better than I can.
I'm glad you mentioned that connection to disability studies and deafness, because it came up sort of a bit when you presented to the whole group. And I was hoping you would say that to this group, because it's really striking. It struck me at that time as something that seemed probably unexpected when you started the project. Yeah. Traci, a different kind of question for you, which is, I think it's maybe unanswerable, but surely you've reflected on it. What is it about love that unsettles the conventional history of these movements, love and sexuality? And I know this is really unanswerable. How did past generations of historians manage to tell this story without the emphasis on these issues? And why do they seem so much more important to us today?
Yeah. I think it's the type of love, right? There's been scholars of the civil rights movement have certainly focused on nonviolence, the love of brotherhood, agape, as Martin Luther King very much celebrated. But what I'm finding is that there's a thread whereby young activists, those of the Black Power movement, those who were of SNCC, the Freedom Summer, their love could be politicized, right? And I think they're thinking about this, particularly the Black Panther Party. They're thinking about that love can be political. It's something that they feel as though love, marriage, family, community has truly been denied to African Americans. And that in trying to attain it and doing so in ways that they can define as their own, right? That really meet the expectations and speak to the experiences of African Americans historically and in that present moment. It could be something revolutionary and radical, right? It could be a tool of revolution. And I think scholars have looked at marriage certainly as for its connections to citizenship. But love in itself, love doesn't always end in marriage. Marriage does not always involve love. And yet, even in both those type of scenarios, they have been used, or at least African Americans have believed that they could be used to advance the race, right? So the couples, the family unit are actually units of activism, right? Whether it's to show that you could obey the tenets of respectability politics, could be one way that sometimes some groups of African Americans believed that they were challenging the image of African Americans and therefore trying to make claims that they were deserving of citizenship, or if it's the complete rejection of everything that is respectable. And trying, I think particularly when I think of that, I think of the Black Panther Party, who believed in free love, right? This is also the moment in which they were living, to love whoever they choose, whether it was a heterosexual relationship or queer. All of this was about taking ownership of self and ownership of community. And I think that's important. I think it's, I will admit that trying to talk about love is difficult because relationships have different meaning for people. And it's hard to really capture the feeling of love on paper to me. And especially for people, many of whom are alive, and you want to do respect to their relationships and how they remember their love. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Let me turn it over to the audience now for questions. Lanier, please, let me just get you a microphone.
Well, I'm going to start with a question for Traci that just follows up on your answer to Roland.
Sure.
And
it's a hypothesis about a thing that's left out of the movement historiography, and so maybe it's like the negative edge of how they could tell the story without talking about this. And it has to do with the relationship between selflessness and selfishness. So one way that a lot of the movement histories are told is as stories of moral greatness rooted in selflessness and self-sacrifice. And our own culture of romantic attachment, which was being reshaped and formed, and which we've inherited very much from that movement, has a strong flavor of self-actualization built into it. And that's incompatible with this self-sacrifice. And so it seems to me maybe the movement historians have kind of elided this in order to tell their story. And I wonder, I mean, yeah, I wonder if you find that that kind of conflict plays itself out in the lives of your subjects, and that they feel this tension between selflessness and selfishness. And then also whether you see that, whether that hypothesis about the historiography is right, and you see that in the historiography.
I think there's certainly some aspect to that. I also think, I've been doing a lot of oral history interviews with former activists. I think, and they've told me a lot, right? And oftentimes I have chunks of interview that I can't use because they'll say, don't use this, right? And I think they don't want some things used because of how the community will be judged, how they might be judged, but also the implications for their children. And so I think you end up tell certain stories. I also think in general, when I was a kid and I didn't quite understand the gravity of it, but my mother used to say to me, what happens in this house stays in this house, right? This is this idea that Black people's personal lives are very private, right? Because they could be used as a tool against you at any moment. And so I think that's also what we reproduce and don't mean to. And I have to say, as a result, because of that lesson that I grew up with and that I understand within my own community, that's sort of the code, right? It's been very difficult in telling these stories, right? How much do you get to tell? While still remaining respectful to your subjects, right? To the individuals that I frankly have grown very fond with. But also being true to the history and the lessons that those stories might actually impart on those of another generation of civil rights, of another generation of activists.
Others.
Thanks. This is great presentations, and I enjoyed the last response. The question for Eli. You're interested in power. How do you relate power to the way in which historians have usually talked about the construction of the societies they're trying to explain and the way change happens over time. How do you relate power to categories like class, ownership? The first project that you worked on is to do with economic data. So are you a Foucaultian?
Thank you for the question. I'm a big fan of many of Foucault's kind of arguments. I don't think I took my theories of power, those from Foucault. I'll say two things. First of all, you mentioned class. Absolutely, one of the bigger kind of emphases in my work is elites and elite power. And in that sense, I think you can see a common thread that runs through the entire book from Robert Yerkes, the Harvard professor who built the multiple choice that later became both the SATs and other things, and even is now embedded into the Zillow application school ratings that we have today and where people live. I mean, so yes, the fact that he was a privileged white guy gave him enormous power, and he came from a very certain class of people. So in that sense, I think power works in that way. Another way that class kind of gets, I think the way choice is very important to talk about power and the structure of choices. One of the myths that the elites tell us is, we're all free and therefore so-and-so got to so-and-so because, he made the right choices. And this is basically, in some ways the messages of the Choose-Your-Own-Adventure books, but also other places. And then we tend to strut agency over things like structure or power or like where someone grew up or what zip code they came from. And so for me, it's very important in my work also to try to show, that a lot of times, just to give the example of the marshmallow test that I gave before. So those of you who don't know, the marshmallow test was this test of kind of this notion that, what separates successful people from unsuccessful people? Why do some people make it rich in the world and other people don't? And one of these themes that actually exists from the 18th century, a story that rich people, capitalists, have always told themselves, is that, we know how to delay our gratifications. And this is a common theme that goes back even further. It's like, the poor people spend all more money, but we save it. Of course, they don't mention that they started with a lot more money, of course, but small detail that gets left out. And so the marshmallow test, which began here at Stanford in the 1970s, but really the turning point in that narrative was the late 1980s when they went back to all those kids who had been tested at like 4 years old. And they found this correlation between the kids who could wait, the 15 minutes for the second marshmallow and the kids who didn't. Of course, later, social scientists went back and looked at the data, and it turns out that the marshmallow test is not predictive at all of who succeeds in life or who gets better SAT scores or who makes more money. It turns out the working class kids who came from, struggling backgrounds were like, I'm taking that first marshmallow because I don't know when that second marshmallow is ever going to come. And so really what this was a class test. And it was a class test, though, that kind of was covered in this myth of choice. And that's very much kind of like standardized testing and many other things. So I would say that one of the most powerful ways that choice is used in kind of ruling society is it's a euphemism. It's a way that we hide certain racial and class and other things. And then, it becomes this individualist narrative of choice. And so definitely one of the goals of my work is to kind of show that the choices that we make are actually very much, embedded in all these different power structures. On the other hand, it's very important for me to say this isn't, a determinist narrative or anything like that. This isn't, I think if you read, it's like, there are some weird things that show up in this book that I don't think anyone would have predicted that had become so popular or so. So in that sense, I want to be clear that it's not, some kind of deterministic structure or all the way down superstructure and all that thing. It's just more a question of, who are the people who got to choose, what were these menus that we would be presented with, and baked into these menus oftentimes. So if you go back and take the multiple choice test that was given to the immigrants in this country in World War I, you had to, know white middle-class culture to get the questions right. So, it was rigged, basically. And in many ways, there's a lot of rigged choices out there. And the question oftentimes is who's doing the rigging.
No.
So this is a question for Lucía. I think it's such an important observation that the inner experience of individuals differs not only in their memories and their knowledge, but just the actual phenomenological experience. And it's really important for understanding this with disability, but just in the differences between us. And I was just curious to hear you talk or tell us a little bit more about the historical differences that you see and the way that those 16th century poets audiated poetry. So I was just curious to hear you talk about that.
Thanks for that, Tanya. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to, one of the ways in which I'm trying to look at this, because it's how do you figure out what happened in people's minds, 450 years ago when they were reading a text. And so one of the things I look at, for example, is back before you could go to a bookstore and buy a cheap book, and then you owned that book, before it was possible to do that, but still within the age of print, people would copy out poems they wanted to keep, texts they wanted to keep by hand into their own personal notebooks or commonplace books, right? And one of the things I've been looking at is how different readers lay out the same poem and what that can tell us, aside from sort of constraints of page size or something like that, right? What those decisions can tell us about how a particular reader might have audiated the rhythm of a poem or might have heard the voice as sort of more speech-like. So if you have a really short poetic line visually on the page, I've found that at least for modern readers, they tend to really sort of hit the rhythm really heavily. The shorter the line is, right, like in a nursery rhyme, the more emphatic their reading will be. But with a longer line of verse, you end up almost in a more conversational delivery style. And what's really one of the things that I've found fascinating is when readers sort of decide to break up a long line into smaller units, not because they hit the margin and they had to hit return, but because that was actually a choice they made. Do they label it then song or not, right? How do those sort of paratextual and material traces signal what happened in their minds when they read, and sort of how do those different copied texts function as records of different readers' audiations over time. There's also, so one of the case studies I'm looking at is John Milton, who writes about his experience of reading and what happened in his, like how he hears voices when he's reading a text that has, say, marginalia written by another reader, right? And how like voices crowd together and then he can't hear the main speaker, the main person in the text, right? And that was well before he went blind, but then how can that sort of help us understand what's happening in his own poetry, how we can read it, how we're being invited to read it by the text, especially when you end up with sort of dialogic voices or sounds in poems. So those are some of the ways in which I'm trying to get at those questions. I think there are other historians like Jonathan Stern or Shane Butler who've done sort of work on a range of historical periods, but in the ancient world especially, that have looked at those questions. They've tended to focus only on voice. I'm trying to sort of move beyond that, but they've also sort of, I think, made some great strides in that field.
Yes, thank you. I was late, so I'm sure I'm going to ask a question that you likely have already answered. And mine has to do with the sociolinguistic context of audiation. So in a given text, 16th century or 21st century, people from different parts of the same language group speak it differently. So Newcastle people speaking English is completely different from people from Liverpool speaking English, different from Londoners speaking English, and different from educated Oxbridge types speaking English. So that presumably that sociolinguistic context will inflect their different audiations. So I have two questions. First is, how do you factor in the sociolinguistic differences in how people actually speak the language. And so how it will affect the way they audiate what appears to be the same text. But related to that is how does audiation differ in a context that is more oral? You know, I'm thinking of India or Africa, where I come from, where all writing is automatically geared toward being spoken, because there's more orality than writing.
Yeah.
So this is actually also sociolinguistic. How does the process of audiation, how does it get inflected in a context, or the different inflections in a writerly context, such as Stanford University, from a more oral context? So those are my two questions.
Thank you for that. I'll start with the second one first, I think. So I've thought about this in a historical way, because it's, I think, one of the narratives that's been challenged in recent, I would say even decades at this point, is the sort of change in the 16th century, 17th century, whatever, from orality to literacy, right? That sort of Walter Ong kind of line. And what I think more recent historians of reading have tried to map are the ways in which oral culture and or sort of oral texts and written texts, if we can put them that way, have interplayed. And so it's not sort of, what we're looking at is not a strictly oral culture or a strictly literate culture, but how do those things inform one another? And they really have looked, I think, quite productively at those entanglements, so that we can better understand that a reader reading by herself in her room at home might well have chosen to read aloud, not because she had to, but because it was a choice, informed perhaps by the genre of text, right? Are you more likely to read a letter aloud or read a Bible silently, or not, right? And there might also be contexts in which groups of readers, like the library, the rise of the library, right? The culture is one of reading in silence, as opposed to aloud, even if you're all working on the same text. And so that's something that happens with the rise of not only the library, but the university, right? Cultures sort of shift, and that these things are all sort of happening messily. And so to speak of a sort of purely in the context that I'm working in, to speak of purely an oral culture or a literate culture is actually, I think, oversimplifying the sort of range of possible, not only types of readerly interactions with text, but types of texts. My work before this originated in psalm culture, sort of the singing of poetic texts that would be shared by readers who knew how to read and people who did not know how to read, right? And how do they learn those words, internalize those words, memorize those texts? Do they understand them as texts, right? I think the answer is yes, they do. Not just they can't read, but that doesn't mean that they don't think of those as textual encounters. So that's a kind of, I don't know if I'm dodging your question a little bit there, but that's the historical perspective. I'm trying to, I tend to have grand ambitions in my work, and they usually tend to be historical, just so that I don't start sort of ranging too far afield geographically. And I try to keep myself to English, because I speak some other languages, but I'm not trained in their study. And so I'm trying to stay in my lane a little bit, but I really do hope that this will be taken up and thought of that by readers who are working in other languages and also in other types of script, right? How does this work for readers of non-alphabetic script? I really want to know. I don't read non-alphabetic script. I have no way into that, but I would love to hear about that work. To jump really quickly to your first question, the sociolinguistic context. So one of the things that got me thinking about this was, in my introductory poetry classes, I have my students memorize 2 poems, and they can choose whichever poems they want, but they memorize them, they come into my office, they recite them, and so they actually have to spend time getting intimate with a text in order to memorize them, right? They read them aloud, or recite them aloud, and then we talk about them for like 20, 30 minutes. It's just some one-on-one time. I'm in a small liberal arts college, I have that luxury, right? And what fascinated me were students who say 3 students choose to recite the same poem, memorize the same poem, they prepare separately, and they produced the same reading with the same, what I would think of maybe 4 years ago as errors in their readings. That I was like, how are you all, like the one example I go to is like there's a poem by Catherine Phillips that reads, "I did not live until that time crowned my felicity," right? And they would all come in and recite, "I did not live until that time crowned my felicity," right? The word is felicity, right? Not felicity. And they would all sort of chant in the same way. And I was like, why are you reading this wrong? Read better, right? Can't you hear this? It's a word, it's language, inhabit it, hear the voice. And I'm hesitant to make assertions about class there, right? But I am willing to make assertions about the sort of time they had spent in the classroom with poetry in high school, for example, the amount of time or resources devoted to that kind of energy, right? And I kept thinking of that as wrong rather than as rhythmic. That they're hearing the ideal form of the poem or the underlying form of the poem. And sort of my job isn't to say, no, you pronounce that word wrong. It's to say, okay, you hear rhythm really loudly. You audiate rhythm really loudly. That's amazing. Now let's think about how the choices the poet has made are working to produce a different texture against that model, right? And so it's helped change my teaching to think less about sort of right or wrong when it comes to my discipline, and more about sort of what different strengths are students bringing to the conversation, and how can we sort of bring those all into play while at the same time developing some of the more traditional skills. So
thank you. Andrea, are you okay if I go? Okay. So I have one question for Eli and Lucía. The conversation got me thinking, so I have one for you as well. Sorry to make you speak so much. So Eli, my question is, from what I gather, you work mostly within American history, like Western history. So maybe this question will be a bit superfluous, but I'm wondering whether you've thought or looked into how people from regions who are not used to this kind of multiple choice react. For instance, I remember seeing the first multiple choice test probably like in 2009 or so. That was the first time I ever experienced such a thing. So I come from a region where people are not so much confronted with these types of choices, I think. So I wonder, do you think that people coming from different regions that are not the American kind of neoliberal capitalist setting have different attitudes and perhaps more resistance to these choices, that they don't take them for as much for granted as perhaps Americans would do, US Americans would do? That's for you. And Lucía, I'm wondering about the epistemological and ethical claims of your project, where you think they're situated, because as far as I know, in philosophy, there has been, also in literature, in all our fields currently, there has been the sonic turn in epistemology and philosophy in particular, where, especially with Martin Jay's book, Downcast Eyes, where we have been trying in the past 50 years or so to transition from a kind of sight-based perception of truth, that we use our eyes mostly to perceive truth. And for instance, Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century wrote about the Germans. The Germans have forgotten to think with their ears. They've put them away in a drawer, and they only think with their eyes, and that might be a problem, right? So like now we've been attempting to move away from that kind of Christian, maybe, and even Platonic way of perceiving truth as something that comes through shadows, through sunlight, and go towards the more kind of Judaic idea of listening to truth, right? So is there a contribution in your book towards that kind of epistemology, the change in epistemology from like a sight-based one to the listening-based one? Are you making a comment on it with this book? And then the second one is, are you also making a comment, an ethical comment, that somehow audiation and the fact that, as you were saying, we all hear different things, but we cannot help but hearing things where we can always close our eyes and discriminate on the basis of the eyes. So is there somehow a claim in which, yes, if we use our hearing more, we will be more inclusive, more open to voices, more attuned to the world than if we use our eyes? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm from Israel, and in Hebrew, multiple choice tests are American tests. And I know there are a few other languages, and I would say that one of the most underrated exports of the American empire is, choice boxes, whether it's the 5-star rating or the multiple choice. But that wasn't your question. Your question was how do people kind of interact with these? And I think in many ways, when I go back to the early 20th century, I have the opportunity, obviously it's different context, but to kind of answer that question through the eyes of both American born, but also immigrants who for them, it was the first time. And I can tell you one of the things that surprised me about multiple choice is how much students loved it. It's this gamified notion that it's easier. It doesn't challenge you. You don't have to think outside the box. You just think inside the box. You also don't need to, it's also this kind of other directedness, which I think is a very uniquely market oriented and therefore in some ways American. And I'm not the first one to argue this, like sociologists like David Riesman. It puts you into this position where you don't even know, you're not asking yourself what's the right answer, it's what you think the right answer that they're looking for. So, and so there's all sorts of different things. So on one hand, I'd say I'd love to tell you a story about resistance and how people, but I think people's first interactions with this is like, this is kind of fun. And that's why it's so dangerous. And I think this gets back to, and I feel like I didn't answer Nigel's question properly. So I just want to add one more thing about this. The parts I like about Foucault and Power is that he takes like everyday things, like the schedule in the opening scene of Discipline and Punish. What I don't like about Foucault's theories of power is just kind of like out there. It's, very kind of, floating around. And for me, the book is about choice architects. It's about very specific people in very specific situations. I point to, I name names. I'm like, that dude over there, he did this. So, in that sense, it's not like this kind of floating, Foucaultian, which I think also Foucault, his theories of power changed over time. But I do think in many ways, by the end of his life, in some ways, he was getting closer to this kind of vague notion of power that I less connected with. So that's just about the power thing. But as far as just, and now getting back to what you were just saying, so I think, in many ways, it's a great question just on what happens when you kind of take these objects and move them around the world. And I think one of the bigger issues that I'm hoping to do with this book is kind of, hopefully, people will, look at these questions from all sorts of different angles. And I'm sure there'll be just one quick example of behavioral economics. There's this foundational study of Richard Thaler who about endowment effect. I won't get into it now, but basically the idea that we value things more if we own them already. And people don't know this because behavioral economists don't like to talk about this, but they went to other countries, developing countries in Africa and other places, and they tried to run these things because they, of course, argued that these are universal, kind of hardwired into our brains, and their little choice experiments don't work there. It's completely different. So in that sense, it's very important always to kind of remember, the context in which these choice experiments are given.
So I'll try to keep my answer a little bit short. I think you're right about the sonic turn. I think this whole the sort of sight-based perception of truth and the sound-based perception or feeling of belief. Yes, that is a sort of standard narrative. I think Jonathan Stern has challenged it really successfully. That the sort of not only whether or not it should be, but has it been the case in practice? And so I think there have been some challenges to that. As far as if we use or tune or train our hearing more, will we be more attuned to the world? If I got that right, I certainly my background is as a classical musician, so I made the shift to this, and I consider myself pretty decent with my ears and with my audiation and with my recall and all of that. And what I've found since starting this project is that I have started to experience the sounds of text in ways that I absolutely did not anticipate. And it's turned it into work, right? What I used to sort of read and take for granted, and I would hear this kind of half voice echo without gender, without age in my head as I read, that's still my default. But if I can actually sit down now and work on it and hear other things in a text, I can actually sort of pull up the sound of a bird song if a poet mentions that, so that I can sort of mix that in the studio of my mind, right? And hear that at the same time that I'm audiating the words of the text, and that does enrich it, and it does make me pay more attention and different attention to the world that I'm actually hearing with my ears. So I think there is a lot of possibility there of listening and listening differently. I do also want to note, this is aphantasia has been a sort of recent hot topic in certain corners of the New York Times and certain corners of the internet. It's been primarily tied to the mind's eye, right? So the fact that people are starting to realize now that some people don't have a mind's eye, and so we can't sort of universalize the body in that way. Some people also don't have a mind's ear. And sort of how do they experience text? I think that's a real question. And how do they, so I want to sort of make sure that we don't miss that aspect of this conversation as well.
Now we're going to take this conversation outdoors. So let me thank our three presenters again warmly.